Max wouldn't leave the tree stump. Jake first noticed it on a cold morning in late autumn. His golden retriever had always been an obedient dog, a creature of habit, following him on their usual trail through the woods behind the house. But that morning something was different. Max wasn't sniffing the usual spots or bounding ahead with his usual energy. Instead, he was frozen near a gnarled, hollowed-out tree stump, his ears perked, tail rigid, body tense. At first, Jake figured it was an animal burrow. Maybe a rabbit or a fox had taken shelter inside. But when he called for Max, the dog didn't budge. He just stood there, staring into the dark hollow like he was waiting for something to emerge. "Come on, boy," Jake coaxed, snapping his fingers. "Leave it." Max let out a soft whimper. Not defiance, fear. Jake frowned. Max was brave, maybe even reckless sometimes, but this was different. The dog backed up, turning his head toward Jake, then back to the stump, as if trying to say something. "Fine, you win," Jake muttered, stepping closer. He crouched near the opening and peered inside. The interior was dark, the damp scent of rotting wood curling into his nose. Nothing unusual. Just decomposing bark, tangled roots, and his breath hitched. A mark, faint but deliberate, scratched into the inner wall of the stump. He reached out, brushing away the damp earth. Beneath the dirt there were more. Not random scratches, letters. "Help." Jake's skin prickled. He stood quickly, brushing his hands on his jeans. Probably just kids messing around. Still, something about it set him on edge. Max was watching him intently. "All right," Jake sighed, stepping away. "It's nothing." But Max didn't think so. That night, he refused to come inside. Jake found him lying near the back porch, eyes locked on the tree line. He had never done this before, never resisted bedtime, never hesitated to curl up at the foot of Jake's bed. But now, he wouldn't even look at the house. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. He was too damn tired for this. Work had been brutal lately, and the last thing he needed was Max deciding to act like some kind of ghost-hunting bloodhound. But then, just as he was about to call for him again, Max's ears shot up. A growl rumbled low in his throat. Jake's frustration evaporated. Max wasn't a noisy dog. He barked when necessary, when someone knocked at the door, when a deer wandered too close to the yard. But this growl was different. Deep, slow, primal. Jake followed the dog's gaze. The woods were dark, stretching endlessly beyond the yard. The wind stirred the branches, leaves whispering against one another like hushed voices. Then he saw it. A figure. No more than a shadow, standing at the edge of the tree line. His breath caught. His instincts screamed at him to go inside, to grab the shotgun he kept by the door. But then, Max lunged forward, barking furiously. Jake blinked. The figure was gone. The trees swayed as if something had just slipped between them, vanishing into the forest's depths. Jake exhaled sharply. He was imagining things. It had been a long day, and the woods played tricks on tired eyes. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been there. And it had been watching. Max stood rigid for several moments before finally lowering his head. He turned to Jake, eyes wide, as if urging him to understand something. But what? The next morning, Max was gone. Jake's stomach dropped when he saw the empty porch. He called for him, his voice cutting through the crisp morning air. Nothing. Panic clawed at his chest. Max had never wandered off before. He was trained, disciplined. He always came when called. Jake grabbed his jacket and rushed toward the woods, his boots crunching over fallen leaves. He didn't care about the chill biting through his clothes. He just needed to find Max. His pulse pounded as he moved deeper between the trees, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Had Max been hurt? Had someone taken him? Then, a bark. Distant but urgent. Jake followed the sound, weaving between the trunks, ducking under low-hanging branches. And then he saw him. Max was back at the stump. He was digging. Jake slowed, watching as Max's paws clawed at the earth, scattering dirt with frantic energy. His fur was dusted with mud, his nails caked with it, but he didn't stop. Jake swallowed hard. "Max," he called gently. "What are you doing, buddy?" Max paused just long enough to look up. His eyes weren't just alert, they were desperate. Jake's stomach twisted. He stepped forward, crouching next to him. The disturbed earth revealed something buried beneath the roots, something dark, something solid. Jake hesitated, then reached into the dirt, fingers wrapping around the object. It was a book. Leather-bound, small, the kind that. The book was old, its leather cover cracked, its spine warped with age. Dirt clung to the edges, packed into its creases like it had been buried for decades. Jake turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of something forgotten, something left behind. Max sat beside him, panting, his eyes locked on the book like he knew its contents mattered. Jake exhaled and brushed the dirt from the cover. There was no title, no name. Just a small, hand-etched symbol on the front, 3 vertical lines crossed by a single horizontal one. A marking he didn't recognize. Carefully, he pried it open. The pages inside were stiff, brittle at the edges, and filled with hurried, uneven handwriting. Some entries were smudged beyond recognition, others torn out completely. But the words that remained sent a chill through him. September 18, 1982. It keeps whispering. In the trees. In the wind. I told them, but they don't listen. They think I made it up. But I see it. Every night. Watching. Jake frowned. His eyes flicked to Max, who had begun to whimper again. Flipping further, he found another entry. October 3, 1982. I tried to run. But it doesn't let go. The stump, it's not just a tree. It's a door. And it's waiting for someone to open it. Jake swallowed. This had to be some kind of joke. Some kid's idea of a horror story, buried here years ago for someone like him to find. Except it didn't feel like a joke. The ink had bled into the pages, the scrawled handwriting shaky, panicked. Whoever had written this had been afraid. Very afraid. Max let out a sudden bark, startling Jake. His head shot up, heart pounding. The forest around them was still. Too still. Jake clenched his jaw and stood. "Come on, boy," he muttered. "Let's go." Max hesitated but followed, casting one last look at the tree stump before trotting after his owner. By the time Jake reached town, the book sat heavy in his passenger seat, its presence nagging at him like a splinter beneath the skin. He parked outside the small local library, a squat brick building that smelled like dust and paper. Inside, an elderly woman sat at the front desk, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses as she peered up at him. "Morning," Jake said, clearing his throat. "I was hoping to look up some old records. Missing persons cases, specifically." The woman blinked. "Missing persons?" "Yeah. From the early 80s, maybe even before that." She pursed her lips. "Well, you'd have to check the archives. Not many folks go digging around in those." Jake forced a smile. "I guess I'm just curious." She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the back of the library. "Microfilms in the last row. Good luck." 30 minutes later, Jake found what he was looking for. The article was small, buried in the back pages of an old newspaper. The print had faded, but the headline was clear enough. "Local girl missing. Search called off." His pulse quickened. He skimmed the article. Lillian Carter, 12, was last seen near the eastern woods behind her family's home. Despite an extensive search, no trace of her was found. Authorities have officially closed the case, citing a lack of leads. Jake stared at the words. The eastern woods. That was his property. A weight settled in his chest. He sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. Lillian Carter. He had never heard the name before, never known about a missing girl from decades ago. And yet, somehow, Max had led him straight to this. His grip tightened around the book. Was it hers? Before he could dwell on it, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Did you know her?" Jake turned. An older man stood near the bookshelf, peering at him with sharp, knowing eyes. He wore a worn flannel, his hands calloused, like someone who had spent most of his life working with him. Jake shook his head. No. I just found something near my property. Made me curious. The man nodded slowly. Lillian wasn't the only one, you know. Jake stiffened. The man pulled a chair beside him, lowering himself into it. There were others. Not many, but enough. Kids, mostly. They'd go wandering near those woods, and then, they wouldn't come back. Jake's throat felt dry. And nobody did anything? The man let out a bitter chuckle. Oh, they did. They searched. Called in dogs, volunteers, you name it. Never found a body. Just things. Jake's skin prickled. Things. Little items. A shoe. A broken toy. A locket. Jake swallowed. And nobody had any theories? The man hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, some folks thought it was a person. Some kind of drifter, snatching kids off the trails. Jake nodded slowly. That made sense. A predator, someone who knew how to cover their tracks. But others, the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper, think it was something else. A long silence stretched between them. Jake exhaled sharply. That's just superstition. The man smiled. Maybe. He stood, dusting off his jeans. Just be careful, son. Some things don't like being dug up. Jake watched him leave, unease curling in his gut. He looked down at the newspaper again. At Lillian's face, frozen in time, smiling. Then, carefully, he turned the book's pages until he reached the final entry. It was barely legible, the ink smeared as if the writer's hand had been shaking. If anyone finds this, it's still here. Please, don't dig further. Jake closed the book. And for the first time, he wondered if he should have left it buried. Jake barely slept that night. The book sat on his kitchen table, its presence almost accusing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the frantic handwriting, the desperate warning. Asterisk, please don't dig further. Asterisk. But wasn't it already too late? Max lay curled near the door, his ears twitching in restless sleep. Jake envied him. His mind wouldn't quiet. The man at the library had said there were others. How many? How long had this been happening? And why did it all lead back to that stump? Finally, at the first hint of dawn, Jake made a decision. If there were more answers to be found, he had only one place left to look. The morning fog clung to the trees as Jake made his way back to the clearing. The forest was eerily silent, as if it, too, was waiting. Max trotted ahead but hesitated as they neared the stump. His tail lowered, ears pinned back. He whined softly. Jake knelt beside him, running a hand over his fur. I know, boy. I don't like it either. But he couldn't ignore it. Not now. Gripping the small shovel he had brought, Jake began to dig. The damp earth crumbled easily under his touch, the scent of decay rising from below. With every scoop, the pit grew deeper. Max paced nervously, letting out sharp, anxious barks. Then, Jake's shovel hit something solid. His pulse spiked. He dropped to his knees, brushing the soil away with his hands. A box. Wooden. Oh. The lid warped from time and moisture. Jake hesitated only a second before prying it open. Inside, he found a collection of objects. A rusted pocket watch. A pair of small, mud-stained shoes. A child's stuffed rabbit, its fur matted, one button eye missing. Jake's breath caught. These weren't just items. They were remnants. Proof of those who had vanished. His fingers trembled as he reached for a folded piece of paper resting on top. Carefully, he unfolded it. The writing was faded, but he could still make out the word. Asterisk, I hear it. It's inside the stump. It whispers. It wants. Asterisk. Jake's heart pounded. A gust of wind rushed through the clearing, sending a chill down his spine. Then, before he could react, Max let out a snarl. Jake spun just in time to see his dog launch toward the trees, his barks turning vicious. Something moved in the shadows. A figure. Jake's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Someone, asterisk something asterisk, was watching. Then, in a blink, it was gone. The forest swallowed it whole. Jake's hands tightened into fists. He had come here for answers, but all he had found were more questions. And now, he wasn't sure he wanted the truth. Because for the first time, he understood. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't over. Jake's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree-line where the figure had been, where something had watched him. Max stood rigid, fur bristling, his body a coiled spring of tension. He let out a low growl, deep and guttural, the kind that sent an ancient instinct crawling up Jake's spine. Something was still out there. But what was it? Jake forced himself to move, scooping up the box of lost belongings and clutching it tight against his chest. The air felt heavier now, thick with an unnatural stillness. Even the wind had gone silent. He turned sharply, his boots digging into the damp earth as he strode back toward his truck. Max followed, but only after one last, wary glance toward the trees. Back home, Jake set the box on the kitchen table, his hands unsteady. He spread the items out carefully, studying them under the dim glow of the overhead light. Each object was a fragment of a life stolen. A pocket watch, its hands frozen in time. A pair of tiny shoes, worn at the soles. A stuffed rabbit, it seems barely holding together. And then there was the note. Asterisk, I hear it. It's inside the stump. It whispers. It wants. Asterisk. Jake exhaled through his nose, trying to steady the unease coiling in his gut. Who wrote this? And why bury it? More importantly, what had they heard? A sudden knock at the door made him jolt. His heart slammed against his ribs. He hadn't heard a car pull up, hadn't seen headlights sweep across the window. Max barked, his tail stiff, eyes locked on the door. Jake swallowed hard and moved toward it, his pulse thrumming. When he opened it, the old man from the library stood on his porch. His expression was grim. You dug it up, didn't you? Jake didn't answer right away. He stepped aside, gesturing for the man to come in. The old man took one look at the table, and let out a slow breath. Damn fool, he muttered. You should have left it buried. Jake crossed his arms. You knew about this. About the stump. The old man nodded. I knew enough. Then tell me, Jake demanded. What the hell is out there? The man hesitated, his eyes clouded with something between fear and regret. They called it the Hollow Man, he finally said. A name passed down through whispers, through warnings. Nobody really knows what it is. Some say it's a spirit. Others say it's something older. Something that's always been here. Jake felt a chill creep through his veins. And the kids? The man exhaled sharply. Gone. Taken. Always near that stump. His gaze flicked toward the box. And the ones who knew the truth? They tried to bury it. Jake's throat felt tight. I found a book, he said quietly. Someone left a warning. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. They always do. Silence settled between them. The weight of history, of loss, of something far worse than either of them could name. Then, the old man took a slow step back toward the door. If you're smart, he said, voice low, you'll burn it. The box. The book. Everything. Jake clenched his jaw. And if I don't? The man's eyes darkened. Then you'll hear it. Jake didn't ask what that meant. Because deep down, he already knew. That night, the whispering began. It crept through the walls, slithered beneath the floorboards, curled around the edges of Jake's consciousness. It wasn't words. Not exactly. It was hunger. A need. Something that had been waiting far too long. Max whimpered from his spot at the foot of the bed, his body curled tight, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. Jake lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. Then, just as sleep almost claimed him, a creak, a shift in the air. Something moved inside the house. Jake shot up, pulse hammering. Max let out a low, warning growl. Jake reached for the bat beside his bed and stood slowly, straining to listen. Another creak. The sound of something shifting just outside his bedroom door. His grip tightened on the bat. His breath came fast and shallow. Then, a whisper. Right on the other side. Jake's skin went cold. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. And as he twisted it open, the lights flickered, the whispering stopped, and the house fell deathly silent. But Jake knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because whatever was inside that stump, it wasn't done waiting.